broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome everyone to our CoachSource Connect keynote webinar with Suzanne Bates, CEO of Bates Communications. Suzanne's topic for today is executive presence and leadership for growth. We have coaches joining us from all over the world, so good morning to those of you in Asia where it's already the morning of May 23rd, and good evening to those of you in North, Central, and South America. My name is Michael Newman, and I'm a consultant with CoachSource based here in the San Francisco Bay Area of California. CoachSource's founder and CEO, Dr. Brian Underhill, is also on the webinar. In a few moments, he will introduce Suzanne. In terms of format for the next hour, Suzanne will be presenting for approximately the first 45 minutes, and then the last 15 minutes or so, we will open it up for questions and answers. So if you have a question during Suzanne's presentation, feel free to type it in the chat box, and we will plan on bringing it up once we get to the Q&A section. As with all CoachSource Connect keynote webinars, the recording will be posted on the CoachSource Cloud sometime in the next week for all of the members of our CoachSource coach community. With that, I now hand it over to CoachSource's founder and CEO, Dr. Brian Underhill, and he will introduce Suzanne. Brian?
Hi, thank you, Michael. This is Brian, and welcome everybody as well. You know, a few years ago at CoachSource, we started to get all these requests for coaches who could work in the area of executive presence. And we didn't always know what that meant. That's always a big laugh for us. We hear that executive presence can mean many different things when we hear about it. And over these last few years, a firm and a practitioner has really hit the nail on the head on what this whole executive presence thing is. And that's Suzanne Bates and her company, Bates Communications. We see them at various conferences that we both speak at and so forth. And she has really become that thought leader in this area of executive presence. One of the things I know she'll be talking about is the Bates Executive Presence Index, the XPI. And it's sort of a 360 type tool that kind of hits all the key areas that we might consider to be executive presence. And it's a very good tool, and they've used it in a number of places. I'm sure she'll share a lot of that research with us. So that's one of the things we'll be learning about today. Suzanne, by the way, has co-authored a number of books, one of which is All the Leader You Can Be, The Science of Achieving Extraordinary Executive Presence. She actually had a former career in newscasting. She was actually in a number of different stations, which means she's, of course, just a great presenter as well. So I was really thrilled when we reached out and asked if she would come talk to our coaches about executive presence and so forth. And if you're interested in learning more about their work or even getting certified in their tool or whatnot, you know, I'm sure you can reach out to them to learn more about it. So joining us from the East Coast is Suzanne Bates. Suzanne, thank you for doing this for us this evening.
Oh, Brian, thank you so much. It's great to be joining you. I have so much admiration for you, for the company you've built, and of course for the CoachSource community of coaches globally. And I'm very excited to share our research, and we're going to talk about a couple of case studies and our point of view on how coaches can help leaders meet the challenge of growth. So you've done a more than adequate job of introducing me, but I thought perhaps I would just tell you a little bit more about us. We are based in the Boston area, but we have certified practitioners around the globe. We've been advising senior leadership for 18 years. We've worked with 20% of the Fortune 500, and our specialty is helping companies move from strategy to execution. And as you mentioned, we have the first and only science-based model of presence that we know of. And also this year we launched a team assessment that I'll briefly talk about today. But I'm very excited, again, to be with you and to talk about this really important topic of growth. So let's set the stage first by talking about why we should even focus on the topic of growth for the leaders we serve. Over the years, we've helped a lot of our clients address the growth challenge, but I think the question everybody wonders is, why does growth matter? So let's take a look at just one representative study that was published recently by McKinsey. They looked at 3,000 software and online services companies, which are regarded as bellwethers for economic growth. And they found that growth yields greater returns to investors and shareholders, It matters more than margin or cost structure over the long term. As we've all heard, you can't cut your way to growth. And over time, they saw clear evidence that growth is predictive of a company's long-term success. All right, well, that's one study from McKinsey. But you may still wonder, is growth really necessary? Does a company have to grow to be successful? Well, it turns out that some of the greatest companies in the world have really struggled to stay on top, and predictions are that that trend will accelerate to 50% being replaced over the next 10 years because they aren't able to stay on the growth curve. And there's historical evidence that companies that don't grow will either go out of business or shrink or be acquired. If we go back to 1965, the average tenure of a company on the S&P then was 33 years, more than 3 decades. So putting that into perspective, it means that a company had time to make mistakes. There was a lot of room to experiment and manage the ups and downs. But by 1990, the tenured time for companies had shrunk from 33 years to 20 years. And that's because, as we know, those of us who were around then, in the late 80s and early 90s, the pace of business was already quickening. And then in the last 7 years, we've seen increasing disruption and volatility, which has claimed a greater percentage of companies. And it's interesting to think about the names of companies that have exited the S&P over the years, powerhouses from Eastman Kodak to National Semiconductor, Sprint, U.S. Steel, Dell, Yahoo, Alcoa, the list goes on. And at this pace, predictions are that by 2026, the time it'll take to come and go from the S&P will be about 14 years. And I hasten to add, we're not just talking about very large global companies. Mid-sized, high-growth companies in your backyard, wherever you live, are also vulnerable. For example, the Kauffman Foundation and Inc. magazine, I'm sure most of you are aware of their list they publish every year. Well, they conducted a follow-up study of companies 5 to 8 years after they appeared on the magazine's list of the 5,000 fastest-growing companies, and 2/3 of them had shrunk in size, gone out of business, or been disadvantageously sold. So, leaders in a company on a growth curve may think they have it figured out when they don't. They may have been riding a new product or service to market or leaping ahead of their competitors for a short time, but they weren't able to maintain it. And that's why we're having the conversation today, because every company has to figure out the formula for sustained growth that goes beyond these early stages. And what's the formula? Well, our research would clearly indicate one of the biggest differentiators is leadership. And the question then is, what leadership qualities drive growth? This isn't easier. I think everybody would have it figured out. So it's important for us as coaches to help our clients figure this out. It allows us to focus our work on helping the leader drive results, and we can engage them more in personal development for a purpose when they understand how the work we're doing is connected directly to their business objectives, including top-line growth. We can partner with them more effectively. One notion we think we can dispel immediately is the idea that growth is just about business acumen and management experience. I doubt there's a single coach on the call tonight who believes that, and if that was all that was required, again, it would be a lot easier. So tonight we're going to talk about not skills or experience, but qualities of leaders that research show matter to growth and how they can execute on the growth strategy. As Brian mentioned, we have an executive presence index assessment. I'll be talking more about it later, but the data we drew from for this study is from our database of surveys gathered through a multi-rater assessment, which, as I mentioned, is the first and only science-based way to measure presence. And it's really leader presence we're measuring. So the XPI was researched and developed by a firm. It was also vetted and validated by an independent panel of PhDs and experts, and we saw exceptionally high reliability scores. So we know it's solid science. And between 2014 and the end of last year, we were able to amass data from more than 14,000 individual responses to the XPI surveys. So then we started to wonder whether we could use data analytics to answer questions like, well, what is it that enables leaders to drive innovation or growth? So before I get to our findings, let me briefly share our agenda for the conversation so you know what to expect. My goal is to make this 60 minutes to really stimulate your thinking about how to innovate your coaching practice and offer your clients more valuable advice on driving growth. And since our research is culled from the data on leadership presence, I will define presence. I'll talk about how we measure those qualities and also how we provide feedback to leaders. I'll also explain how we designed the study, and then we'll dive into the findings on high growth leaders and find out how they're different. I'll review how we coach leaders to develop the qualities associated with growth. And I'll give you kind of a peek behind the curtain about how we recommend you interpret and make assessment data relevant for leaders so they really buy into the coaching. And then I'll end with some strategies for incorporating this into your coaching practice. And I'll also talk, as Brian suggested, about how, if you're interested, you can enjoy joining our community of practice on leadership presence and become certified. So we define executive presence as the qualities of a leader that engage, inspire, align, and move people to act. We developed that definition of presence after extensive research into management and leadership theory, communication theory, social action theory, psychology, philosophy, and even ethics, because we wanted to describe presence as a whole leader phenomenon. So that definition is, as you can see, a lot broader than the way many people think about presence, and that's by design, because it seeks to describe why presence matters to a leader's ability to drive organizational performance. The model has three dimensions: character in red, substance in teal, and style in the gray. And you can think of these as the three faces of a leader, from the innermost qualities that define who we are as people to the outermost qualities that are easier to see. All three dimensions are really important aspects of a leader's presence, and as you'll learn in the qualities that define these dimensions, most leaders have a mix of strengths and gaps. As I mentioned, it's a global assessment now used in 17 countries, which I know is important to all of you who live and work globally. And our global practice continues to grow. We've drawn the research from leaders in all industries, so you can be assured that the findings would apply to leaders that you're working with. So let's now talk about the design of the research project so we know how we got this data. We designed the project by first defining high growth and low growth, and we defined high growth as 5% or more above GDP, which is 3 standard deviations above average corporate growth, which was at 2% for that 3-year period. And we defined low growth companies as -1% or less, again, at least 3 standard deviations from the norm. The data was obtained through publicly available information from Morningstar. So we looked at our database then of 14,000 surveys to match those companies with leaders in our database. And we took out that vast middle. So we only looked at high growth and low growth leaders. So before I reveal what we learned, I'm really interested in finding more about you. So I'm going to, in just a moment, ask Michael if he would launch the survey. But would you say you're coaching and advising leaders mostly in high growth, mostly in low growth, or a combination of the two types of companies? So you can go ahead and launch now, Michael. If you don't know, that's okay. You can click on that button. The poll's anonymous. We really just want to get a sense of the group here and understand the business environment of your clients. I think that may inform your questions later, but we'll be talking about working with leaders in both high growth and low growth companies. So no matter what your answer today, whatever we talk about is going to be, I'm sure, quite relevant to you. And if you don't know, again, that's fine. So Michael, how are we doing on the answers? Are we ready to close the poll?
I think so. Anyone want to put in your answer last minute? You're welcome to get it in here in the next couple seconds. Otherwise, I think we've got almost everybody. We'll go ahead and close the poll now. And sharing results.
And if you would read those, please, that would be great. I think some of us, including myself, won't be able to see them, Michael.
Absolutely. One moment.
One of the things I wanted to let you know while Michael's pulling that up is leaders in both high growth and low growth companies really face challenges of their own. It can be chaotic in high growth to figure out how to sustain that growth over time, which is really the challenge. And of course, in lower growth companies, the challenge is trying to get some traction especially, when there's just enormous pressure to turn things around.
And for results, for those of you who may be joining us via phone, we have 39% of participants saying mostly high growth. No one said mostly low growth, 0%. 61% said a combination of mostly high growth and mostly low growth, and nobody said I'm not sure.
Well, that's good, isn't it? We all know where we're working, and that's excellent. Well, no surprise there. I think there are a couple of reasons why we wouldn't be working mostly in low-growth companies. Sometimes we find there's a lack of awareness about the importance of leadership and leadership development, and of course, low-growth companies are often strapped for funds to do the kind of investment that they need to do in their leaders. So exciting that many of you are working in mostly high-growth companies. Probably not a surprise in many parts of the world because the global economy is booming. All right, well, let's move on. If you'll give me back control, Michael, I'll go on and I will talk about, thank you very much, the model of executive presence. I mentioned it has 3 dimensions represented by the 3 titles at the top of the page: character, substance, and style. And beneath each of those dimensions, you'll see 5 qualities, 15 in all. As you can see, the model is pretty intuitive. It's easy to recognize what we mean by these names of the facets or qualities of presence. They're familiar, although there is a lot of research under them, and we define them very specifically in leadership. But we intentionally wanted to create a model that was intuitive. Now, the assessment is of great value to leaders because it doesn't just define the 15 qualities, it measures how others view their behaviors in this area, in all these areas. And I know all of you work with these types of tools, with any multi-rater or 360. We ask peers, direct reports, managers, and others, maybe the board, to rate the leader on 90 items, 6 in each behavior. Each of those 6 is distinct, so it's a rich, robust report. And as most of you are well aware, what's measured by instruments like the Hogan or the MBTI are tendencies or preferences. This assessment doesn't do that. It looks not at how you're likely to behave, but rather how others are currently observing your behaviors. So they're observable behaviors and therefore actionable. We can coach to them. So think of it as a snapshot in time, providing the leader and you, the coach, with a compelling, detailed view of how the leader's actions and behaviors are experienced and felt. And as we all know, there's often a gap between perceptions and intentions. What the leader and the coach learn when they review the individual report are how various rater groups see the leader, as well as how those perceptions compare to the leader's own view of his or her behaviors. So that really opens up a conversation about the gap between perceptions and intentions. And as we all know, leaders have the best of intentions, but they aren't always communicating and demonstrating what they intend to communicate. So what I'm going to do today is provide you not with a detailed description of each of these 15 facets. I think they're pretty intuitive, but I would like to take a moment to talk about the dimension and what's in each dimension, just so we get anchored in it. So the character dimension includes qualities that we develop early in life, our family of origin often. And they're still amenable to change, but they reflect how others see our disposition, our temperament. And these qualities are mostly associated with trust, for those of you who have done a lot of research and study on the topic of trust. So it includes authenticity, integrity, concern, restraint, and humility. A lot of things that are very current in the literature today. The substance dimension includes qualities we develop as adults with experience over time if we're on the leadership track. And they reflect how others see us behaviorally and situationally. And these are really critical qualities to having others experience our credibility. So this dimension includes practical wisdom, confidence, composure, resonance, and vision. And then finally, style it's a way of doing things. That's the way we define it. And in terms of leadership, it's how we use active, iterative dialogue with people in order to get everybody aligned and get things done. So style is crucial for execution. It includes appearance, intentionality, inclusiveness, interactivity, and assertiveness. Now, you may wonder, what types of questions or items do we measure? How do we get at these behaviors? Well, this is a representative sample of 3 items out of 90. We asked raters to score on a Likert scale from 1 to 5. So in practical wisdom, one of the 6 questions we asked is about the leader's ability to appraise complex situations and go directly to the heart of the matter. That's the leader who can cut through complexity and focus everybody. In concern, one of the 6 questions is whether the leader takes time to listen and leave others feeling heard. And of course, that's critical to engagement. And then in residence, one of the questions we ask is whether the leader is adept at reading and responding to nonverbal messages, which of course is critical to anticipating issues and addressing them so they don't derail the project. It earns leaders' respect. So now that you have an idea of the types of items we ask about on the XPI, the next question I'd like to ask you is, in your experience, who is in charge of growth? Because we're going to get to the growth data now. I'll ask you to kind of picture in your mind a client of yours who's in charge of growth. Perhaps they stand out in the crowd, they're running a business, they have responsibility for the P&L or profit and loss statement, they may head up sales, they might be in charge of product commercialization, or some other area of the business that drives revenue. Who are you thinking about? Who's that blue pencil who stands out? I think it's safe to say that leaders we most often picture are high energy, confident, assertive, go-getters. They get things done. And so I'd like you to keep that person in mind for a moment as we talk about this. It turns out that in our data, and we'll be showing that in a moment, the leader who is action biased and results driven, confident, assertive, and business savvy has a lot of the qualities that are important for growth, but they're only the price of admission. What we learned are those qualities are helpful, but they don't determine the leader's ability to drive growth. Good to have, but not a distinction. So let me now show you the qualities that did distinguish leaders in growth companies. What is it that they do? We found there were 9 super behaviors where leaders in growth companies really excelled. 5, it turns out, are in the realm of character, and 4 in substance. So in these areas, leaders in high growth companies receive scores significantly higher than those in low growth companies. As we look at the behaviors that were difference makers, you'll see none of them are the harder driving aspects of leadership. So let's take a moment to unpack this chart. In high growth companies, leaders were significantly above the norm when it came to sincerity, not being fake or phony. They were evaluated to have higher integrity, especially in the area of promise keeping and being guided by a strong internal moral code. They considered the ethical consequences of their actions. So the picture that emerges here is a leader who's trustworthy and credible. And if you move to the second dimension, substance, you'll see a picture emerge of a leader who is practical, calm, and also visionary. So this leader is exceptional when it comes to offering keen insight, sound advice, and judgment on business decisions. Their composure prompts a thoughtful attitude and an objective perspective in others. And that inspirational side of vision is important and differentiating in leaders in growth companies as they create that enterprise view of challenges and opportunities. Taking the analysis just a step further, we also found that something called the high-powered 4. So this is a subset of that super 9 I just showed you. And these behaviors are in bold letters. Here, the high-growth leaders really excel, and low-growth leaders perform significantly below average. So the distinguishing factors were whether the leader is guided by a strong internal moral code, is sincere, so what they say can be taken at face value, whether their composure prompts a thoughtful attitude, and that 4th item was whether the leader exercises sound judgment on decisions affecting other stakeholders. So very interesting, isn't it, to see the importance of character and substance. As a matter of fact, when we pull up what we see, there are 29 behaviors in all that are statistically significant that differentiate leaders in high growth companies. And one of the things I'd like to point out is that 19 of the 29 are in the realm of character. So what does that tell us? It tells us that the character of the leader is not just a nice to have that promotes a healthy culture of trust. That trust is essential to growth. This is a fact we now see in our data. So obviously, we believe this is a key insight. Coaches, leaders, those in talent and executive development can't ignore it. When we're selecting, promoting, coaching, and developing leaders for these roles where they're driving growth, we need to be talking about character and substance. Even if they've been successful managers, many of them may need to further develop and cultivate these areas of leadership. They certainly need to appreciate the value of doing things like maintaining a code of ethics, even when it costs them in the short term, which is often difficult as leaders rise through the organization. They need to be able to apply all that hard-won wisdom and also remain resonant with the organization so people feel they're in touch and in tune. I should mention that character qualities are often rated significantly lower in low-growth companies as well. They lag in 59% of the character behaviors. So that doesn't mean that leaders in low-growth companies necessarily lack character, but rather their raters don't see them as exceptional or even average in character compared to other leaders. So these may be unintended behaviors. They might be behaviors that reflect the culture of the company, but for whatever reason, these leaders need to dial up the character aspects of their leadership. Integrity, as you saw, is one of the 5 qualities of character, and it turns out in our research that integrity is the most important of all when it comes to growth. There are more items in integrity out of those 29 that matter than any other quality overall of presence. So every leader knows integrity matters, and most would say it's core to their identity. But remember, what we're measuring here are perceptions of the leader's integrity, not necessarily their intentions. So the first of those qualities that matter is honesty and promise keeping, followed by guided by a strong moral code, can count on him or her to do the right thing even if it costs him or her dearly, walks the talk on values of honesty and promise keeping and fairness, and carefully considers ethical consequences. The only one that wasn't a big differentiator was the last one, consistent match between what he says and does, or what she says and does. So a lot to take in there, and what I thought I would do now is bring that to life with a couple of case studies, and I will go through these quickly, but I'd like you to get to know a couple of leaders who completed an XPI assessment by way of revealing what were some of the qualities that were enabling them or hindering them from helping to drive the growth formula in their organizations. Both these leaders from Fortune 500 companies, each in a senior executive position, playing a significant role in the growth strategy. However, that was really where the similarities end because they're different people with very different XPI profiles. Let's look first at Kevin, who's in a high growth company. At the time of our research, he was COO and number 2 in a multinational technology company. His company had enjoyed 12 out of 14 consecutive quarters of above market growth, beginning prior to the 2017 economic resurgence. So how did others see Kevin? What you see here are 3 of his strengths circled in green and 3 of his lower rated qualities circled in red. So his strengths were in integrity, which we've talked about, practical wisdom, which we talked about, and confidence, which is the ability of a leader to help a group look at the data, own it, make decisions that they are responsible for. His lower rated qualities were concern, inclusiveness, and interactivity. None of those are really critical to the growth formula or differentiators, although all of those qualities, of course, are important to leadership, and he elected to work on those qualities of presence. But I'd like to note that even his lowest scores were above average for most of the leaders in our research. So here are his scores on integrity, and I think this gives you a pretty good idea of just how highly regarded he was in the area of integrity. And that is really supported very much by the comments that we found at the end of the survey, because we always ask people to comment on what helps and hinders the leader's leadership presence. So people said things like, Kevin has the interest of the company ahead of anything else. He's very ethical, can be completely trusted. He displays a high level of consistency between what he says and does. He will fight to maintain his values and is willing to put himself at risk for what's right. His truthfulness is the foundation of his integrity. Kevin's the person employees would trust to foster a value-based management culture. Employees want him to be the next CEO. Pretty impressive stuff. In Practical Wisdom, they said Kevin's astute and a quick study. The key issue in any discussion is quickly brought to the fore. Brilliant, analytical, and tactical mind brings difficult issues down to areas and topics that simplify complex issues. Kevin has an uncanny ability to distill the noise. He balances his strength and decisiveness with humility, and he'll step in when action is needed. So, you can see by these stellar comments, there was very little people had to say negative about Kevin, and as it turns out, 2 years later, he was made the CEO of the company. Now I'd like to turn to Eric, who was a leader in a lower growth company, just by way of contrast. A good guy, Eric, and as you can see, he has a different set of strengths and gaps, although there is a little bit of overlap with Kevin, both of them strong in practical wisdom and confidence. Eric's other strength is an appearance, which is, in our model, that readiness and energy that are so powerful and contagious in a leader with presence. Eric's lower rated qualities are humility, resonance, and inclusiveness. He's not high in most of the qualities we found were differentiators for growth. So let me tell you just a little more about him. His commercial and defense aeronautics company had experienced 5 years of flat results at the time the XPI was completed. And among his cohort, Eric was identified as a top performer. He was considered a ready now candidate for senior executive leadership and on the critical path to company growth. But we found when working with Eric, he was perhaps not as ready as he and maybe others perceived. As the report showed, while he had strengths in practical wisdom, confidence, and appearance, those gaps were really holding him back, and I think in a way preventing people from seeing some of those qualities that might be the growth drivers in authenticity and integrity and in vision. The open-ended comments also supported this view of Kevin, who many felt was so sure of himself that he could be direct and pointed, but that could make him not approachable, not open to others' ideas. Because he's so quick to understand in the resonance area, he has the ability to leave others left behind. That tendency causes people to disengage, and I'm sure we've all worked with leaders like this, and we've helped them as well. The point of looking at the comments and the data really is to get to a degree of specificity as we're working with leaders on precisely what it is that they need to do to remove some of the obstacles to enabling them to feel and be very effective. So now that we've had a chance to know a leader in a high growth and a low growth environment, I'd like to turn to the process of interpreting the data and working with clients like Eric to help them develop insights that help them move the needle on their leadership style. So this is typically a 40-page or so report with a rich set of data. And we thought it would be valuable to share how we go about taking a client through the process. I mean, we're not going to walk you through every step, but just by way of talking about how we try to engage and inspire leaders to look at this as more than just another familiar assessment, another story, the same old, but really make it a roadmap for making a greater impact on the business and achieving business outcomes. The assessment process is going to be very familiar to you. I think it's important for us to say here that I'm a big advocate of being very involved in selection of raters, maybe not down to the names, but giving guidance to the leader, to the HR leader, others who are sponsors or mentors of the leader, to make sure you get a great mix of their fans and those who are in a position to look with a critical eye and be objective but direct in their feedback to them. So they complete the assessment, and then what we do is we take them through an orientation, allow them to prepare for an insights meeting before we actually do the interpretation. And I'll talk more about why we do that now. Orientation is where we spend some time with the leader understanding what their business challenges are. Now, this may be a quicker process for those of you who are already working with a leader and know the company, but it's very important, we feel, to have context and we get that in the orientation call or meeting. We also spend time orienting the leader to the report because we feel it is absolutely imperative to get the leader engaged in reading the report and thinking about it before you sit down to interpret. One of the things that I think doesn't serve leaders well is to walk in the door, hand them a report, go through it in real time without their having a chance to analyze it for themselves. I think it just creates more ownership and more engagement. In the interpretation call, the second meeting, which takes place in short order, this is where now we hope the leader at least has done some of their homework, and they've answered some questions in a development guide, and they've started to reflect on questions like, what do different rater groups see as my strengths? What do they see as my gaps? How is that different from my self-perception? What am I curious about as I go into the conversation with my coach? Here's an example of the bar graphs that will again be familiar to those of you who use assessment. So this is at the beginning of the report. It simply compares the leader's ratings to others' ratings. So what you're looking at here, and again, most of you would be familiar with this format, are 5 qualities in the character dimension with 2 bars in each category, the gray representing self-ratings, the red representing all other raters, and the black range bar tells you how much variation there is among all raters. So this helps the leader get oriented and, again, begin to wonder, why do others see me as better than I see myself? Or if I have an unhappy blind spot, why is that? And then we can move into getting to the heart of the matter. I think it's very important to take the client back to affirm their strengths before they leap to the development areas. If you can ground them in their strengths, you can return to that theme again and again as you look for paths for developing in other areas. They can always leverage their strengths. When you transition to development themes, it's important to get to a place where you're confirming maybe just 3 or 4 you're going to look at, so that you end up with really 2 themes that are most important in the coaching. That way you have a focus. And you can also begin then to talk about what are some of the potential obstacles to their developing. Then you can take them deeper into the report, and this is, again, going to be familiar to many of you. What you're looking at here are 2 of the items in the character facet in authenticity. And there you see the definition of authenticity as being real, genuine, transparent, and sincere. So you can see you would have a lot to discuss with a leader looking at this particular report because, of course, one of the things I noticed first is on both questions, there's a very wide range among direct reports on these questions. So with 6 direct reports ranging from a 2 to a 5, that would be a really fruitful area of discussion. So you can see just looking at an item or 2 how robust the conversation becomes and how specific and actionable it is, which is really, I think, the leading thread to helping leaders start to take action on the report. Now, I'm a big believer, and we all are at Bates, in making sure that our clients follow up in a very meaningful way with their raters. Some of you may be familiar with the research of Marshall Goldsmith. He published a study of 86,000 participants who did no, little, frequent, or consistent periodic follow-up with raters, including their boss and others. And what they found was very significant improvement in perceptions of the raters on the leaders' focused areas of improvement. So the lesson is the more in-depth and frequently that our leaders, our clients follow up with their raters on a routine basis, the greater the observed positive change in leadership effectiveness. And what we say to our clients is there are many reasons why we need to have a meaningful conversation. First, of course, it conveys appreciation and interest in their views. And as a result of that, it creates room in the relationship for constructive dialogue. And then others become willing to share their observations with us. And they really appreciate, talking about the leader, they appreciate that the leader is willing to change, and they're more likely to trust that leader's intentions even when they maybe trip up. So that really enables us to start to move the needle on perceptions, and it enlists the raters in the development of the leader. And the rater conversation process, we think, is very important to coach a leader to do, because this is where they're going to get a lot more information if they handle it properly, if they handle it with care. We coach them to collect their thoughts. And we talk about each rater as a separate individual. And we explore what their hot buttons might be with that individual so that they're prepared emotionally for the conversation and can keep it focused. So they set the tone, keeping the meeting focused on a couple of themes. And then at the end, we coach them to validate their understanding of what the raters told them and make a contract between them to stay engaged and to help one another. I did want to touch briefly on working with groups of leaders for those of you who do that. We have often used the XPI assessment in companies that are driving for growth, and we've used it to illustrate to them where are the group's strengths and where are the group's gaps or areas of development. What you're looking at in this graph is a group of leaders. I think that there were probably 17 or 18 in all. So you'll see that 9 and 2 doesn't add up to 18. Why is that? Well, 9 in the group would have had authenticity in their highest 5. 2 would have had it in their lowest 5, and then the rest would have been neither high nor low. So if you were looking at this as a coach of a team or a group, and this is not a team assessment, we have a separate assessment on, that assesses team performance, but this is a good way to look at a group and just say, as individuals, what are our collective strengths and gaps? And you might look at this and say, well, what leaps out at you, for example, in a company striving for growth is the vision is pretty high. So that aspect of leadership isn't perfect, but it's low in, I just got that wrong. It's low. Okay, so it's a low in 11 of the 17. What does that tell you? Well, there's going to be some challenge there, isn't there? Because they're going to need to dial up vision and help inspire people with a view of where they're going and why. Resonance, again, which is important. It is one of the qualities that was important to growth. Again, they're low, generally low in that one. And composure, which we also mentioned. Authenticity is, pretty high. So they have some things going for them as a group. But overall, there's definitely some work to be done with this group. So those of you who are coaching groups, I think might find this is a valuable conversation tool. So I'm going to open it up to questions in just a moment. And as Michael indicated, we want you to type those questions into the chat box if you haven't already. And while you're doing that, I'll just talk about joining the Bates community of practice. We have a wonderful community in the Coach Source community globally. We're also growing our community of practice, and many of coaches, I think, have joined our practice. And it's mostly, I think, because they're working in this area of presence and leadership. It's coming up for them in conversations with the organizations, and they don't want to rely on guesswork to discuss presence. They want to discuss it intelligently. And Brian, I think you may recall that a study you published shows executive presence is the #2 reason people request coaches. So I guess you could see why our community is globally. Yeah, it's very exciting. Yeah, so if you are interested in, and we can go back to this in a moment, but I just wanted to let you know, if you are interested, we can send you some information. But our next certification here in Boston is in October. You can go to our website, bates-communications.com, to find out more about it. And really, the process of joining our community is attending a certification program and becoming designated, and then you get access to our research and our best practices and our webinars and portal access and the ability to use the XPI assessment. So that's that for now, and let's open it up to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Suzanne, for the engaging presentation. And I also wanted to comment, I love the colorful slides with the blue pencil standing out, the classic yellow phone with the headset and the cord. I haven't seen one of those in decades. And fascinating data as well as very engaging slides. So we're opening it up to questions and answers. You can go ahead and type in your question in the chat box.
And while they do that, Suzanne, this is Brian. I remember when you first put out the instrument, but I don't believe you had all the high growth, low growth, and all of that in there yet. I believe this is a newer development that I'm now seeing where you're correlating the
Yeah.
instrument to that. Is that right, or am I just not remembering it properly?
Oh, no. Well, when we first started the assessment, and we didn't have the data yet, so we have now our proprietary database of many, many leaders who've completed the assessment, and that's given us the opportunity to look at the data. And by the way, we also published an earlier paper on the qualities that drive innovation. So I'll be talking about how you can get copies of the white paper on growth, which is what we based today's discussion on, our white paper on driving innovation with similar, the qualities aren't the same, by the way. There is some overlap, but different qualities that are differentiators in driving growth and driving innovation. Because when you think about it, growth and innovation are different. Innovation is kind of messy and creative, and you've got to have creative tension, and you've got to be willing to fail a lot. And growth is a little bit more of a driving aspect in a business, staying focused on metrics and helping motivate people. So I think that would be an interesting contrast for coaches who are working in both of those areas with leaders.
Wonderful. So we've got a couple questions. I'm going to go ahead and ask one of these here. And Timothy has a question. Timothy, I'm going to attempt to unmute you so you can ask Suzanne directly. And if that doesn't work, I can go ahead and ask her directly.
Hi, Timothy. Are you on the air?
Okay, Timothy, you should be unmuted. Timothy? Well, I'll go ahead and ask it here. Timothy asks, do the group results come from an average of each individual's results, or is it a group application?
Yes, they came from the average of individual results. So if you were in the 9 who had authenticity as a high, as one of your top 5, then you went into that group of 9. So again, it's not a team or group assessment. It is, what we were doing there is compiling individual results just to give them a snapshot of how collectively they show up, looking at their individual strengths and gaps. As I mentioned, we have developed now a team assessment, and we define a high-performing team as one that unleashes the creative genius of its members to create the extraordinary together. So we're very excited about that work as well, because it enables the team to look at itself as a unit, which is a whole other way of looking at high performance. And we'll be publishing more on that shortly as well.
Wonderful. So our next question is coming from Samuel. Samuel, I'm going to unmute you so you can ask this question, and we'll unmute you now. Samuel, can you go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, my question is regarding resonance and interactivity. How do you actually measure these two areas or values?
Yeah, I'm gonna go back to this at least so we can be looking at it. So you asked about resonance. Well, we define resonance as the leader's ability to read the room, anticipate how people think and feel about issues, make it okay for people to express those. It's attentiveness and attunement to what's going on, not just in the room, but in the organization. And resonance, of course, is a quality of social emotional skill. Many of these are social leadership, and it's really critically important, obviously, in engagement, but also because it's in the substance category, it's about how credible the leader is. In other words, do people see that leader as being attuned to what's really going on in the organization? What was the other area you asked about?
I think I had muted him temporarily, and when we go back here, Samuel, if you want to also say your location so we know where in the world you're dialing in from.
Yeah, I'm actually calling from Singapore. Yeah, the other one would be under style, interactivity.
Activity, yeah. So interactivity and inclusiveness and intentionality are all, we call those the three I's because that's the communicative, dialogical side of leadership. It's execution, how we get things done. And interactivity specifically is the nuts and bolts of communication. So how frequently and effectively do we communicate what people need to know, when they need to do it, so we it's a dialogue. It's not a one-way communication, but it's has the quality of keeping people abreast of what's happening, staying on top of things, enabling them to communicate with one another so that we can stay informed and get things done.
Great. Our next question is from Sheila. Sheila, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you so you can ask your question. If you wouldn't mind telling us your location as well, we'd love to hear that. Sheila, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you to you both, and I'm calling from Toronto, Canada. Maybe a little bit unusually, I'm really interested in the low growth companies. And I wonder, Suzanne, if you could tell us a little bit, for example, we know that culture makes a big impact on people's behaviors. And I wonder if you can give us an example when a client revealed that it's the culture that is, in quotes, at fault. Then what? How do you then continue the debrief and manage the learning process for that executive?
Yes, it's very challenging when you're working with one executive in a company where you're aware of the cultural pressures and norms there. Very often I have used that as an opportunity, and I'm sure you see where I'm going with this, to talk to the organization as a whole about how these qualities have an impact, because this really is a lot about leadership culture, which sets the culture for the organization. One of the things that I think is important for a leader who's in a challenging situation where, let's take Eric for a moment, because he was in an organization where operational excellence was absolutely number one. So you had to get it right. Very high integrity, but other things suffered. There was a lot of confidence, but that shut down conversation. It prevented ideas from being brought forward. It could often prevent the organization from hearing about problems and issues, and it certainly had a depressing effect on engagement. So with him, we did actually have a pretty good rapport with the CEO and the CHRO and others. So we were able to open up a dialogue. But what if you don't? What if you're really working in a vacuum? I think it's important for that leader to identify champions like himself or herself who are more inclined to lead the way they are. I think it's important to have that conversation, for them to have that conversation with their manager if the manager is open to it. I think it's important for them to find mentors, and you can help them do that, both inside and outside the company. Ultimately, some leaders may decide that it's just not a cultural fit for them, but that's not, of course, the outcome that we're looking for. We're looking to help them be successful in their roles and in the company. So, part of, I think, the development process, at least in my experience for the last 18 years, is helping leaders get a voice. I mean, you've got to be smart about it. But the other thing I think, and I'll stop here, Sheila, is one of the things I've noticed in the companies where we're working with this more broadly is it has changed the language, and it's changed how people are thinking about the leadership culture. The leader I talked about in the first example, Eric, who now is CEO, they're going to use this as part of their model for launching their initiative on changing cultural values. So it can be a really important conversation starter.
Thank you so much. That was very helpful.
If there aren't any other questions, or if people are still forming their questions, I thought what I might do, Michael and Brian, is let you know, I talked about certification again. The next certification program in Boston is October 23rd and 24th. And if you go to our website, bates-communications.com, you'll find it under assessment. And I have it circled there. But just click on that and you'll get information. And of course, you can write in with your questions. We also have a Bates library. I mentioned the papers, the white papers. This is the paper that I've been pulling from for today's conversation is Leadership Secrets of High Growth Companies. So you can download that, some of our work on teams, our work on championing innovation, where I mentioned the research on innovation, by going to bates-communications.com and go to our blog and click on Special Report. That's where you'll find those white papers. If you'd like to join our executive presence community in LinkedIn, you're not required to be a certified practitioner. It just requires an interest in the work on executive presence. So perhaps it's coming up for you. Maybe you have something you'd like to contribute. We welcome all writing and all blogs, and we just ask that you write to us at info@bates-communications.com if you're interested, and we'll send you an invitation. For those of you on social media, I'm on Twitter at CEO Coach Bates, and of course you can find me on LinkedIn. My name, Suzanne Bates. And that's all the many ways you can contact me. I'd love to hear from you. I always like to hear what other coaches are doing around the world in their practices. I know that executive presence is a hot topic of conversation, not just inside the U.S. and North America, but all around the world. And so welcome your conversation, and would invite you to write me at info@bates-communications.com.
Wonderful. Thank you, Suzanne.
Brian, and this is Brian. I'll just add, as you know, at CoachSource, we have on your online profile a place where you can check if executive presence is a particular specialty of yours. And particularly if you do pursue some of this study with Bates Communications, make sure you put that in your certifications area so we can catch that. A number of you have done, extra training in this, and then that's how we can catch it to make sure when we get these types of requests at CoachSource that we can get your name would pop up for our managers who can get your bio out there.
Thank you, Brian. And I wanted to hasten to add that some of you may not want to travel to Boston, although we do get coaches from all over the world. It's a wonderful experience, I know, when you can get together with coaches from other countries. But in case that isn't an option for you, we are planning to offer the certification virtually, probably toward the end of 2018.
Great.
Fantastic. We are almost at the top of the hour. Suzanne, there is one more question. I don't know if you're able to take one more or if you would like to go ahead and close it. I know it's late. It's almost 10 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time in the U.S.
Oh, no, we're going strong now. Yeah, right ahead.
Wonderful. So this question is from Andrew. Andrew, I'm going to unmute you, and if you can tell us where you're attending this webinar from and ask your question.
Sure. I'm in Los Angeles, California. And Suzanne, what I've noticed is many executives, when they really try to focus on their presence, are looking for one style or one way of doing things. It's not exactly a cookie cutter approach, but they get very married to one way of doing things. And of course, as executives, I think at least, they need some agility in their presence. They need to adjust, respond to different situations, to different stakeholders. And the downside of this can be that they may show one face to some people and another face to others, and then some people feel they're being inauthentic. So there seems to be a built-in tension between maybe resonance and authenticity as I see your model, or to the extent I understand it in this last 45 minutes. So how do you handle situations like that? How would you coach an executive in that sort of situation, or getting that kind of feedback?
Yeah, I think it's important for leaders to get in touch with who they are, right? Because you do need to be able to flex. There's no doubt about it. You have to be able to flex with various people and understand what's on their minds or what they may be concerned about. But you also have to show up consistently in the qualities that we measure here in executive presence. I mean, integrity is integrity, right? So it's a very astute point you made, Andrew. We do find that there's a yin-yang effect in the model. So nobody except maybe Eric, Kevin, is as strong in everything. I don't usually see that, although the senior most successful leaders are. But authenticity is often at odds with restraint, believe it or not. I haven't looked at the resonance question, but if you think about it, people who are highly authentic say what's on their mind. They may blurt it out. There is such a thing as an overstrength in all of these, including authenticity. That may mean they're lower in restraint. So what effect does that have on others? Well, it has the effect of making them not feel necessarily as safe, too much information, right? Or they feel the leader is too reactive. But the opposite can be true, where if a leader is too restrained and doesn't show any emotion, then people have they may feel they don't know who the leader is. So this is one of those Goldilocks principles. Not too much, not too little, just right. And, it is true. I think that leaders get befuddled about this at times. It isn't that easy. What's required of them as they move to higher and higher levels in an organization is very different. So, but I think really it goes back to being the real you. As long as you're extending yourself and demonstrating qualities like humility, being interested in other people and resonance, like you say, then, people accept you as a leader for who you are. So I don't know if that answers your question fully. It's probably another full hour of discussion for us.
I appreciate what you've just said, and I think you're right. We could at least do an hour on it. My takeaway is that there's a core to all of us, and certainly a core to executives, and they need to have the self-awareness to be comfortable and recognize that core. From that core, they can flex. If they flex too far outside, then become inauthentic. But if they stay congruent with that core, then the chances are people hopefully won't perceive them as being two-faced or whatever negative they want to apply in a present situation. And I can appreciate the nuance in the model from what you just said. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's very well said. Thank you. I appreciate it. And, I think what I often do is I return to the items because they're very specific. And if you then look at different rater groups as well, maybe direct reports feel this way, but the manager doesn't, I think it gives you a really wonderful roadmap for the development conversation.
Thank you again, Andrew, for your question, and Suzanne for being willing to stay a couple minutes later. We'd like to thank everybody, in particular Suzanne, for presenting this Coach Source Connect keynote webinar. And this will be posted on our Coach Source cloud, so coaches can go back and listen to it later. That's typically posted within a week. And we will be at the Conference Board's Leadership Development Conference in San Francisco, June 7th and 8th. We're proud to sponsor this conference, and we invite anybody who's attending to stop by our exhibit table. Brian's going to be speaking in London at the University of Reading Henley Business School, for those of you who may be in Europe listening now at very early hours of the morning, or anybody listening to the recording. And then Brian will also be speaking at ICF Midwest in Pittsburgh on June 23rd. And again, we thank everybody for attending tonight's webinar. And you can look at the cloud for any other upcoming events. Thanks again, Suzanne, and we wish everybody a good night and good morning to those in Asia.